and when I did, I accidentally dragged the hook through the snow and pulled up my hat. It had been buried off to the side of the trail in the snow, buried neatly with the snow smoothed over the top so that it was completely hidden. Had the snow hook not scraped down 4 or 5 inches, I never would have found it. I stopped the sled and set the hook once more. While knocking snow out of the hat and putting it on my head, I studied where it happened. Right next to Storm. He had taken the hat, quickly dug a hole, buried the hat, and smoothed the snow over it, then had gone back to sitting, staring ahead, looking completely innocent. When I stopped the sled and picked up the hat, he looked back, saw me put the hat on my head, and I swear, smiled. Then he shook his head once and went back to work, pulling. Along with the jokes, Storm had scale eyes. He watched the sled as it was loaded, carefully, calculated the weight of each item, and let his disapproval be known if it went too far. One winter, a friend gave us a parlor stove with nickel trim. It was not an enormous stove, but it had some weight to it and some bulk. This friend lived 12 miles away. 12 miles over 2 fair hills, followed by about 8 miles on an old abandoned railroad grade. We needed the stove badly. Our old barrel stove had started to burn through, so I took off with the team to pick it up. I had left early in the morning because I wanted to get back that same day. It had snowed 4 or 5 inches, so the dogs would have to break trail. By the time we had done the hills and the railroad grade, pushing in new snow all the time, they were ready for a rest. I ran the last 2 miles to where the stove was and unhooked their tugs so they could rest while I had coffee. We stopped for an hour at least, the dogs sleeping quietly. When it was time to go, my friend and I carried the stove outside and put it on the sled. The dogs didn't move, except for Storm. He raised his head, opened one eye, did a perfect double take, both eyes opening wide, and sat up. He had been facing the front. Now he turned around and faced the sled, so that he was facing away from the direction that we had to travel when we left, and watched us load the sled. It took some time to fit, as the stove barely fit on the sled, and it had to be jiggled and shuffled around to get it down between the side rails. Through it all, Storm sat and watched us, his face a study in interest. He did not get up, but sat on his back end, and when I was done and ready to go, I hooked all the dogs back in harness, which involved hooking the tugs to the rear ties on their harnesses. The dogs knew this meant that we were going to head home, so they got up and started slamming against the tugs, trying to get the sled to move. All of them, that is, but Storm. Storm sat backwards, the tug hooked up but hanging down. The other dogs were screaming to run, but Storm sat and stared at the stove. Not at me, not at the sled, but at the stove itself. Then he raised his lips, bared his teeth, and growled at the stove. When he finished growling, he snorted twice, stood, turned away from the stove, and started to pull. But each time we stopped at the tops of the hills to let the dogs catch their breath after pulling the sled and stove up a steep incline, Storm turned and growled at the stove. The enemy. The weight on the sled. I do not know how many miles Storm and I ran together. 8, 10, perhaps 12,000 miles. He was one of the first dogs and taught me the most, and as we worked together, he came to know me better than perhaps even my own family. He could look once at my shoulders and tell how I was feeling, tell how far we were to run, how fast we had to run. Knew it all. When I started to run long, moved from running a work team, a trapline team, to training for the Iditarod, Storm took it in stride, changed the pace down to a long trot, matched what was needed, and settled in for the long haul. He did not get bored, however, and one day while we were running a long run, he started doing a thing that would stay with us until the end. We had gone 40 or 50 miles on a calm, even day with no bad wind. The temperature was perfect, 10 below zero. The sun was bright, everything was moving well, and the dogs settled into a rhythm that could take them 100 or 1,000 miles. And Storm got bored. At the curve in a trail, a small branch came out over the path we were running, and as Storm passed beneath the limb, he jumped and grabbed it, broke off a short piece off, about a foot long, and kept it in his mouth all day and into the night. He ran, carrying the stick like a toy, and when we stopped to feed or rest, he would put the stick down, eat, then pick it up again. He would put the stick down carefully in front of him or across his paws and sleep. And when he awakened, he would pick up the stick, and it soon became a thing between us, the stick. He would show it to me, making a connection between us. Each time we stopped, I would pet him on top of the head and take the stick from him. He would emit a low, gentle growl when I took the stick. I'd examine it closely, nod and seem to approve of it, and hand it back to him. Each day we ran, he would pick a different stick, and each time I would have to approve of it. And after a time, after weeks and months, I realized that he was using the sticks as a way to communicate with me, to tell me that everything was all right, that I was doing the right thing. Once, when I pushed them too hard during a pre-Iditarod race, when I thought it was important to compete and win, a feeling that didn't last long, I walked up to Storm, and as I came close to him, he pointedly dropped the stick. I picked it up and held it, but he wouldn't take it. He turned his face away. I put the stick against his lips and tried to make him take it, but he let it fall to the ground. When I realized what he was doing, I stopped and fed and rested the team, sat on the sled, and thought about what I was doing wrong. After 4 hours or so of sitting, watching other teams pass me, I fed them another snack, got ready to go, and was gratified to see Storm pick up the stick. From that time forward, I looked for the stick always, knew when I saw it to the sides of his head that I was doing the right thing, and it was always there. Through storms and cold weather, on the long runs, the long, long runs where there isn't an end to it, where only the sled and the winter around the sled and the wind are there, Storm had the stick to tell me it was right. All things were right. And it came to Storm to grow old. 8, 9, then 10 years, and he slowed. He trained many pups, and finally he retired and stopped pulling. We tried to make him a pet and move into the house, as we often do when dogs retire, but he didn't want that, didn't want to leave the kennel. He rattled around in the house and kept trying to walk out through the windows and glass doors, so we let him outside and kept his food dish full and left him untied. For a year, Storm was the old man in the kennel. He sat in the sun and played with the pups and watched the team leave and come back, and always he had a stick. He would hold the stick when I came out to the kennel and to harness, and when I returned from a run. Another year passed, and he grew blind, and his thinking changed so that he was not always aware, but he still was happy. He sat by his house, and when he heard my steps coming, he would hold the stick out for me. Sometimes I would go to his house and sit next to it in the sun, and he would lay his head on my lap with the stick in his mouth, and I would think of the things I had forgotten about. Young things and old things, long runs and short runs, puppies and the cold and the wind, northern lights and firelight against the snow, the creaking sound of an old-fashioned lash sled moving beneath me, and the joy, the raw, cold joy of going again and again inside the diamond that is the northern winter, and all with Storm. And there came a time when it was supposed to end. Storm failed and began to wander aimlessly through the kennel, bouncing off the other dogs' houses. And I knew it would not be long until he faced east, as so many of them did when they died. I wanted to leave him loose for that, so that he could find the right place. But we had some new dogs, and some of them were aggressive and insecure and wanted to fight all of the time. They would even almost fight Old Storm when he came too close to their circles, though it was rare for young dogs to attack older, more respected ones. I did not want Storm to end that way, in violence, so when I went on a trip one day, I left Storm tied to his chain. It was a temporary thing, just until I got back, but while I was gone, it came on Storm to end, and in the final time of his life, he somehow got the chain wrapped around his doghouse so that he could not face east, could not do it properly. I saw where he had struggled and torn at the ground with his old claws to get around, to face east as so many animals do if there is time in the end, but he could not. He could not tear the chain out of the ground, could not wear it around, could not move the house, could not face east and end it right. And it was my fault. I should have known this was the day that he would end, should have felt that he was going to die. I should have known better, known to let him loose, even if there was a risk of a fight. After all, it would be natural for him to fight. They love to fight. But I did not. It was my fault. And when death came and Storm could not face east, that he knew I would be upset. Storm knew I would feel bad. And he did the only thing he could do. When I came back the next day, I went to the kennel, and there was silence until I came close, and the dogs went into the death song, which sounds much like the rain song. And I knew then Storm was gone. Knew before I saw him, but knew before I even arrived at the kennel. It is a low song that stays low and does not go into the keening whine that means excitement. And I felt all the sadness that comes with the end of a life, and went to take his body from the kennel and bury him. I found him next to his house. He had jammed into the side, trying to get around to the east. The earth was torn beneath him. The chain held his head north. But he didn't blame me. I will always blame myself, but Storm did not blame me. His last act, his last thought, was for me. Storm lay dead, and in his mouth was a stick. The stick. Our stick.